All right. Before introducing today's talk and speaker, I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement that McGill University, which is one of the official sponsors of today's talk and my employer, is on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence marks this territory on which people of the world now gather, including us. My name is Kevin McDonough. I'm Associate Professor of Philosophy of Education at McGill University, and also a member of the Center for the Study of Learning and Performance at Concordia University. And I'll be introducing today's speaker and moderating the discussion that follows. And along with my co-organizer, David Waddington, who's Professor of Education at Concordia University in Montreal, and co-director of the Center for the Study of Learning and Performance, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. It's nice to see some familiar faces and names and a large group of people with us. I'd also like to acknowledge that today's talk is hosted and funded jointly by the Center for Study of Learning and Performance and the Office of the Vice Principal of Research and Innovation at McGill University. And I just wanted to check in with Dave Waddington to see if do you have anything you want to say as co-director of the CSLP and the relationship between the speaker series and the aims and purposes of the center before we go any further?
Well, I won't burden you guys with too much about that, just that the center is delighted to be presenting Meira here today, and that I'm really looking forward to the talk, and I'm delighted that we could sponsor this event.
Thanks, Dave. Okay. So before we get to the talk, I have a few preliminary comments about how things are going to work on this Zoom. I know people are pretty familiar with this format, but maybe overly familiar. But just so that things can, proceed as smoothly as possible, the talk should run about 45 minutes or so in length, maybe a little bit shorter, Meira says. And after that, there'll be an opportunity for people in the audience to ask questions. So during the Q&A, we'll ask you to use one of two formats to pose your question. First, we encourage you to raise your hand using the icon down at the bottom of the screen to indicate that you'd like to pose your question orally. Or alternatively, you can post it in the chat. Tessa and I will be monitoring the chat box, do our best to read out any questions that appear there, give the speaker a chance to respond. And finally, we'll be recording the talk, and it will be posted. The video will be posted in the coming weeks to the CSLP YouTube channel for public access alongside other talks that we've sponsored in the past. Some good ones there, so you may want to check those out. And last, I think, but not least, or two sort of technical points. In order to avoid unintentional interruptions, just remind you to mute your microphones during the talk. And looks like everyone's been good about that. And there's also an interpretation button. We have simultaneous translation into French. There's an interpretation button at the bottom that you have to, if you want to access the talk in French, you can click on there and see the interpretation. So thank you for listening to those preliminaries. And now it's a genuine pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Meira Levinson. Dr. Levinson is Juliana W. and William Foss Thompson Professor of Education and Society at Harvard Graduate School of Education. Her areas of research include civic education, racial justice, and educational ethics. She's currently working to start a global field of educational ethics modeled after bioethics that is philosophically rigorous, disciplinarily and experientially inclusive, and relevant to and informed by educational policy and practice. That'll be central to her talk today. And her most recent articles in the area are on conceptions of educational equity and grappling with the aftermath of COVID-driven school closures in the US. Like many people, Meira's work has focused over the past few years on COVID issues. She served on the Lancet COVID-19 Commission's Committee on Safe Work, Safe School, and Safe Travel. And she's authored white papers, policy guidance, and articles on the ethics of school reopenings, particularly in light of some families' schooling hesitancy, and is currently completing a research and professional development initiative with educators in 10 countries on the ethical issues they face under COVID. Meira's written and published a lot. She's written and co-edited 6 books, including Democratic Discord in Schools, Dilemmas of Educational Ethics, a book that I use in, books that I use in my teaching a lot, some great case studies on ethics and education in there. No Citizen Left Behind is another of her books, and it's been translated into Chinese and Japanese recently. She shares educational ethics resources on the justiceinschools.org website. There's a lot of great video materials on there, some interactive case studies. Again, I've used it with my students. It's really worth checking out if you're interested in issues of ethics and education. She's published resources for youth activists and teacher allies at another website, youthinfront.org. I expect we'll put these links in the chat shortly. And in each of these projects reflects Meira's commitment to achieving productive cross-fertilization without loss of rigor among scholarship, policy, and practice. And Meira earned a BA in philosophy at Yale and a DPhil in political theory at Nuffield College, Oxford University. And she also taught middle school for 8 years in the Atlanta and Boston schools. That's my introduction. I'm going to turn things over to Meira for her talk. Thanks, Meira. It's all yours.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. I really appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for showing up. It's so great to see people, at least people's names I know, and some of you faces that I know, and I'm really honored to be here today. And I'm really grateful to Kevin and Dave for organizing this series and inviting me to talk to you guys. Let me just get started. What I'm going to say is an argument about that I hope you will be excited enough about to join in this enterprise. So it's an argument that sort of culminates in an invitation. Or maybe the argument itself is just an invitation from start to finish. And as Kevin said, and as you saw from the title that was advertised, this is going to be a talk about why I think we need a field of educational ethics and what a field of educational ethics might look like a little bit. So to start with, I'm assuming, insofar as most of you have a connection to education in some way, this is not going to be much of a surprise to you, but I will say that educators, including, say, teachers, school leaders, face challenging ethical decisions on a regular basis, right? Ranging over a hugely enormous landscape, from curriculum to discipline, to assessment, to family engagement, to politics, to all sorts of other things. So I'll just offer 4 brief examples just to give you a sense of what I'm thinking about. Let's start with discipline. So let's say David is a student who's struggling academically. He frequently tries to mask his struggles by playing the class clown, which of course disrupts other students' learning. So how should his teachers balance David's needs against those of his classmates in responding to his outbursts? Second, we can consider grade inflation, which Alana Feinefter Rosenbluth, who's on this call, and I have written about together, which a number of studies have shown is rampant worldwide. So should department heads enforce stringent grading standards to establish an ethos of excellence and academic rigor? Or say turn a blind eye to grade inflation because it helps students secure admission to selective universities and to higher paying jobs? A third dilemma, politics. So we've seen a number of elections and referenda in various countries in recent months, in the United States just last week, that pit nationalist, populist, and/or authoritarian demagogues against more democratically oriented candidates. Teachers in state-sponsored schools are rightly expected to remain nonpartisan, but they're also expected to teach civic values, which in democracies presumably includes democratic values. Given this, should teachers in state-run schools have remained nonpartisan in the most recent elections in the United States, Italy, Brazil, or Israel? And fourth, let's think about family engagement and curriculum. Let's say a school that serves a predominantly conservative Christian student body is being pressured by its parent association to remove sexual orientation and gender diversity awareness from the health and wellness curriculum. If it doesn't, the parents have indicated that they will opt their children out from the entire course, which is permitted by the regional school authority. How should the school respond? Right, so 4 examples. I hope that at least 3 of them, if not all 4, will have you nodding along saying, yeah, that's an ethical dilemma. I see that there are hard choices and values at stake here as educators and school leaders confront these. So let me turn to, say, policymakers. They also frequently confront ethical dilemmas, and I'll give a few examples. Say, let's consider a high-achieving, in the United States, so-called no excuses charter school that has very strict criteria for what are required to stay in the school. Should they be required to, say, reduce their well above average attrition rates as a condition of expanding their charter if, let's say, their academic success rests in part on students' and families' compliance with its expectations? So, second example, how should a financially strapped school system balance its budget? By eliminating gifted and talented programs, charging fees for extracurricular activities, or eliminating professional development supports for new teachers? Or as a third example, data from a new statewide teacher evaluation program, let's say, reveals that male teachers of color receive significantly lower scores than other teachers with comparable levels of experience in comparable settings. How should the state respond? Hopefully, you'll agree with me that these are not exotic problems, right? They're everyday dilemmas. But at least in my experience, both as a teacher for a number of years and then as somebody who tries to support teachers and school districts and policymakers, I don't think educators and policymakers just generally receive really little support in thinking through these kinds of dilemmas as anything other than technocratic challenges, say of leadership or data analysis or instruction. They're rarely treated as ethical challenges of equity, merit, respect, inclusion, or fairness. That is, as challenges that require educators and policymakers to think carefully about the values and moral principles at stake. And this is despite the fact that educators, school board members, school and district administrators, and also parents and citizens frequently agonize over just these questions. So you might imagine that, say, those who do care about the ethical questions at the heart of work as educators could turn, say, to moral and political philosophers for guidance. But with all due respect to moral and political philosophy, I don't think that these fields offer much insight, frankly. This is in part because moral and political theorists address surprisingly few questions about education, I think, in any real depth. There is a set of questions that they address. So school finance is a big one, particularly the accommodation of cultural and religious diversity is another one. And I think that's because of a set of court cases that have arisen, particularly in the United States, although also in other countries. There's been a lot of writing about the accommodation of cultural and religious diversity. And actually, Canada is a good source of many of those, and thinking also about language diversity and so forth. There's a lot of writing about parents' rights, about the aims of education, and about distinctions between education and indoctrination. I think all of those are really, really, really good topics to have a lot of good thinking and writing about. But there's a vast number of other fundamental questions that have been virtually ignored. Most of the examples that I've given you, not all of them, but most of them. And then I think even more to the point, when educational issues are discussed by moral and political theorists, these theorists tend to apply generalist moral and political theories to often quite stylized educational problems. But I think one can get only so far with general normative theories that have been developed for and about adults, about people who are presumed by these theories, say, to have relatively fixed capacities, to be reasonable, responsible, and rational, and to have present-day interests that matter deeply and likely even trump their far in the future interests. These kinds of presuppositions, I think, render these kinds of theories totally unable to address basic features of the educational landscape. So any approach to educational ethics that's worth its salt, for instance, must recognize that from a developmental perspective, children are often appropriately non-compliant, unreasonable, at least from an adult's perspective, and even irrational, again, from an adult's perspective. That's not to say that they're not reasoning inside their head and that they don't have good reasons from their perspective for what they are doing. But it does mean that when they bite their sister, or when they throw a tantrum in the middle of the grocery store, or when they do their homework but they don't turn it in, right? That from an adult perspective, this is not the most reasonable behavior, even if all you're trying to do is advance your own interests, right? So to work out the ethical trade-offs at work in dealing, say, with a disruptive student like David, you need a normative theory that treats disruption of other people's projects as a predictable and even normal feature of childhood. That's also true. Think about the kid who does their homework and doesn't turn it in. And I have had many such students in my time, and they drive me nuts, right? But you need to actually have a normative theory that that is not just, well, they need to be held responsible and get a 0 or whatever, or no, we at all points just need to be nurturing and caring and say, oh, that's okay, try again tomorrow, but we have to have something, right? So we have to have some kind of ethical system that takes widespread unreasonableness as a given, while still aiming to show its subjects respect, which is something that we, I think should agree that children are due, and that helps them become more reasonable over time, which is one of the reasons that we don't just say, oh, forget the homework day after day after day. So this kind of question about what such an ethical system would look like reveals, I think, a second necessary feature of theorizing about educational ethics, namely that it offers an account about the relationship between children's present day well-being and future well-being. So many no excuses schools, as they're called in the US, for example, justify their practices of giving demerits to children as young as 5 for slumping in their seats, or actually just looking out the window as opposed to making eye contact with the speaker, on the grounds that their students tend to come from communities in which fewer than 10% of kindergartners normally graduate 16 years later from university. So in order to ensure that zip code is not destiny, These schools enforce rigorous behavioral expectations in the here and now so that their students have a much higher shot of graduating from university and living safe, productive, and happy adult lives for decades to come. Is this ethical to profoundly restrict children's natural impulses to look out the window, to slump in their seat, and their present day well-being for the sake of future well-being? I think this is an essential question to answer, right? Like, we have to have an account of this if we're going to think about educational ethics. But it's bizarrely one that most moral and political theorists offer little guidance about, because they tend to theorize about already formed and often presumptively autonomous agents. I don't want to say that nobody's theorized about this. I think that Harry Brighouse and Sunny Ladd and Susanna Loeb and Adam Swift's book on educational goods has done a really nice job of addressing this. And there are others who have written about sort of childhood goods too. So it's not like this is totally off the radar screen, but still, even there, we don't have a really clear account of how we think about this trade-off between the present day and the future. Let me talk about some other features, I think, of educational ethics that are also distinct from a generalized moral and political theory. For one example, children's, say, natural endowments, which is a term that gets used a lot in liberal political theory, like Rawlsian political theory, and luck egalitarians and all sorts of people, are in many ways, so their natural endowments are in many ways socially constructed through schooling itself, right? And since children's future capabilities to learn are developed by or stymied by schools, educational ethics is also recursive. The difference is both an input and an output. So part of the task, I think, of any theory of educational ethics is thus to set boundaries around the social construction of difference. What is acceptable as an incoming difference? For example, should we expect a school to educate a student who is blind and deaf and incontinent, or should we not? Should we expect a school to educate a student who started reading at age 2 and who is figuring out, calculus at age 8? Or should they be sent to a special program? What are our terms for actually accommodating a student who is deeply disruptive? Right? Like, these are all forms of difference, right? Should we accommodate a student who needs to take a day or two off a week for religious, services, right? All sorts of differences may arise, and we have to have a theory about what kinds of incoming differences we accommodate, what we do with those differences, like what differences we provide in order to mediate these differences, and then what kinds of outgoing difference are we willing to accept, right? To what extent are we, how much outgoing difference should there be in academic attainment, in social integration, in the languages that children learn, in their career prospects, in their level of happiness, right? I mean, all of these things, we need a theory of like, how much variation do we allow? And then what do we do in that mid spot where you have people coming in with differences and you have some theory about what's acceptable there, you have a theory about what's acceptable with respect to the outgoing differences, and so then you need to have a theory about what kinds of differences we engage in terms of educational provision and activities to mediate that pathway, right? So how to address the ethics, going back to one of my examples about an ethical dilemma from policy, of cutting gifted and talented programs versus charging for extracurricular activities, depends, I think, on having insights into these kinds of considerations. Other distinctive features of educational ethics, I think, include the need to theorize distributive justice and corrective ethics simultaneously. So if you think of corrective ethics as being about reward and punishment and how we recognize and treat people who have done wrong and like try to teach them how to do right and reincorporate them back into the community. You think about distributive justice as being about the distribution of goods in some ways, or capabilities, or, I don't really, opportunities. I don't really care how you theorize it, but like, these are really linked in the educational context, since, say, how you deal with a disruptive student has complex consequences for children's academic and moral learning. And so, that's one example of how they're really tightly linked. And relatedly, how individual and collective needs and rights should be addressed simultaneously is another, I think, core thing that you have to think about in educational ethics, because children are almost always grouped together in a class. And weirdly, political theory has very, very, very little to say about that, right? It thinks about structures and systems, or it may think about the rights of individuals, and it says almost nothing about how we think, and we'll think about like provision of certain, like rights to groups, like linguistic minority groups or something, but it doesn't think about when you are providing a good to a group of people, and there's stuff happening within that group, right? Like that's where it doesn't quite think, it doesn't have a theory of sort of the individual versus the group needs within a system like a classroom. So given these distinctive kinds of questions raised by what is really a cursory consideration of the ethical challenges that arise in schools, I think we need a new field of educational ethics. I don't think we just need more work applying extant ethical theory to educational problems, although that can be useful. Nor do I think we need solely more work translating extant scholarship to policy and practice, although that may be useful too. I think we actually need new work that asks distinctive questions, draws on distinctive sources and kinds of evidence, including empirical educational research and practical insight, and that generates knowledge for a distinctive set of audiences. So if I've convinced you so far that we need this field of educational ethics, then the question is, all right, so how should we get there? And what models are available to guide us or to throw cautions our way, right? Like what might be appealing, but we're like, ooh, don't want to go that way. So when I've been looking around for models in the last 7 or 8 years, the obvious one, and really actually from my perspective, almost the only one that has sprung into view is bioethics. And this is in part because from the beginning, bioethicists were really clear that they needed to ask new kinds of questions that moral and political philosophers had not asked, and that they needed to pursue new modes of scholarship that incorporated scientific and medical understanding in addition to philosophical inquiry. I also think it's a useful model because, as hard as this may be to believe, bioethics literally did not exist as a field 60 years ago. It only came into being in the late 1960s and 1970s, and academic positions in this field are even more recent. And like, you may think, wait, how can that be? Clearly bioethics, like there's always been bioethics. Really, there hasn't been. Like, there just wasn't before the 1960s. And despite its comparatively brief history, bioethics has achieved phenomenal outcomes. It's generated, I think, essential insights into both individual level biomedicine and population level public health research, policy, and practice. You can think about the ethics of abortion and end-of-life decisions, genetic testing use, human subjects research, stem cell research, healthcare resource allocation, quality adjusted life years. We could sort of keep going on about the number of concepts and topics that bioethics has actually really brought into life almost out of thin air. It's also important to realize that clinical bioethicists, which is actually a role, are directly employed or retained as consultants by major hospitals, public health departments, and NGOs, such as the World Health Organization, Doctors Without Borders. Philosophy departments, medical schools, public health schools also have regular tenure lines in bioethics, as do some law schools, public policy schools, religion departments, nursing schools. I mean, it's really literally unimaginable for the field of bioethics not to exist. As I would like it to be unimaginable in a couple decades that the field of educational ethics didn't exist. So I think it's a really helpful question to ask, like, what helped bioethics go from non-existent to inescapable in only 60 years? And so I'm going to simplify enormously. But simplifying enormously, I think bioethics developed historically to address three kinds of problems. First was the problem of large numbers of people treating many other particularly vulnerable people unethically in the name of scientific and medical progress. In the United States, two of the most infamous examples are the Tuskegee syphilis study, in which African-American men were deliberately denied treatment for syphilis, despite their actively seeking such treatment. And then also the research done at Willowbrook State School in New York, where intellectually disabled children were intentionally infected with hepatitis in order to research the disease and to help develop vaccines, which they were successful in doing by requiring that the parents who placed their children at Willowbrook State School agreed to have their kids be infected with hepatitis. So one reason that these studies and a surprising number of others were taken to be ethically significant, and that it was taken, it was thought that biomedical research ethics would be a necessary response, was precisely because these studies were not hidden. Although we think now as if, Tuskegee must have been like this secret enterprise, it had hundreds of people working on the study over decades. These actually couldn't be blamed on a few bad apples working in secret, or a few rogue doctors or scientists who flouted the collective consensus about what was medically or experimentally acceptable. Rather, they proceeded in full view, at least for some observers. Obviously, they didn't proceed in full view, say, of the African-American men who were being told that they were receiving syphilis treatment when in fact they weren't. But many, many, many people knew about these. And so once studies like Tuskegee and Willowbrook were acknowledged or say reimagined as ethical outrages, then they were thought to require an institutional response, say through the creation of institutional review boards, IRBs and the like. And the idea was that even well-meaning researchers and clinicians might make ethical mistakes, and hence that a proactive institutional structure was necessary rather than something more individualized or reactive or one-off. So that was the first problem that bioethics was created to address. The second problem was that new technologies were enabling scientific and medical procedures and outcomes that ended up in, or even like created, ethically uncharted waters. So here, think of end-of-life care, designer babies, stem cell research, and CRISPR gene editing. So bioethics came of age during the DNA revolution, alongside, say, in the US, the public fiercely debating Roe v. Wade, which legalized abortion, and debating, say, who should have the right to decide Karen Ann Quinlan's and later Terry Schiavo's life-extending care. All of these technological innovations, which hadn't existed a few decades before, and then the ethical quandaries that they sparked, provoked a flowering of new theoretical work, as well as a raft of new public roles. So then there's a third challenge that bioethics came about to address, which is stemming from the second one. How do you resolve disputes about what is ethically required, permitted, or forbidden, say, in specific clinical cases? And who has the authority to decide, especially when the patient's judgment is in question, because, say, she's a child or is incapacitated in some way? So that third challenge spurred the development of a whole class of clinical bioethicists and consulting bioethicists. So as I mentioned, most large hospitals in the United States, for example, now have on-call clinical ethics teams who are available to consult with medical staff, families, and hospital administrators, often on a same-day or 24-hour basis. Alongside the explosion of clinical roles came a flowering of policymaking and policy advising bodies that either focused directly on ethics, or at least invited ethicists to the table in conversation with other stakeholders. The most prominent of these, again, in the United States, because that's where I've been sort of researching this the most, have been the presidential commissions on bioethics, which are widely agreed to have spurred the development of the field. In just one 5-year period from 1978 to 1983, for example, the President's Commission for the Study of Ethical Problems in Medicine and Biomedical and Behavioral Research, i.e. the Presidential Commission, published influential white papers on defining death, setting forth guidelines that were adopted by almost all states and medical facilities, because they now were at the stage where they could say distinguish among brain death, et cetera. Making healthcare decisions, screening and counseling for genetic conditions, securing access to healthcare, and splicing life, the social and ethical issues of genetic engineering with human beings, as well as a half dozen other papers. Although many of these white papers, policy recommendations, and the like have been focused on novel questions prompted by technological advances in science and medicine, they've also expanded to address population level questions about, say, vaccinations, right, which we've all been thinking a lot about over the last few years, quarantine, triage, distribution of kidneys, and primary care versus tertiary care facilities, and evaluation metrics such as QALYs, or quality adjusted life years, and DALYs, disability adjusted life years. Bioethical advisors, in particular philosophers working in tandem with scientists and doctors, have had enormous impact in health policy and population level decisions at the WHO and other international bodies, as I'm sure that you've seen under COVID. So let me step back for a moment from the professional roles that people have come to fill in bioethics and return to the major problems that bioethics came into being to address. So first, widespread unethical practices. Second, technological advances that create novel ethical dilemmas for which no answers could yet have been developed. And third, lack of mechanisms for dispute resolution. So in my view, educational policy and practice face these same three challenges, right? So let's consider 3 examples of widespread and widely accepted, but I believe unethical, treatment of children in the United States in the name of educational progress. First, as I mentioned briefly earlier, children as young as 5 in many schools are expected to sit in virtual silence for 6 hours a day, including lunchtime. There is no recess in many of these schools. To hold their bodies in prescribed positions when sitting in class and walking down the hallways, and to accept punishment uncomplainingly if they violate these expectations. Unsurprisingly, these children are overwhelmingly brown and Black and poor. Educators and policymakers try to justify this treatment of highly vulnerable populations on the grounds that, as I said before, zip code or postal code should not be destiny, and on the grounds that their educational needs are so urgent that developmentally appropriate educational practices do not apply. A second example, nearly half of all school districts around the country shame children whose parents owe money for school lunch. Shaming practices include stamping children's hands, I need lunch money, throwing children's food away, publicly distributing dunning letters, requiring children to do physical labor to earn lunch, like cleaning the tables in the cafeteria, and denying children food entirely. As a third example, consider that over 300,000 children per year before COVID hit, before the pandemic, faced criminal charges and fines for offenses including skipping school, arriving late, wearing inappropriate jewelry, violating uniform policy, writing on desks, and not making eye contact. This is in the United States. Students who fail to pay can end up being incarcerated. If nothing else, educational ethics should find a means of taking treatments of vulnerable populations like these off the table, right? In years, let alone decades, we should be looking back at this and treating these treatments of children in the United States as just as outrageous and unimaginable as we treat, say, the treatment of patients in the Tuskegee syphilis study. In some cases, it may be that theory development will be useful. For example, in the cases of schools being designed around incredibly deferred gratification. This first case of what you require 5-year-olds to do. In other cases, such as the lunch money shaming or the incarceration of children for non-criminally violating school rules, I don't think we need any kind of complex ethical theory, right? We just need to find a way to draw public attention to the issues, create an outcry, build demand for policy reforms, and so forth. So part of the reason that I'm advocating for a field of educational ethics is because I think it could actually help promote these goals and mechanisms. And there's a number of ways that I think that educational ethicists could make headway against unethical policy and practice. These could include convening international bodies to create consensus guidelines or documents that account for the vast differences among settings and contexts, while also delineating bright lines that no school or system should cross. Or they might propose a set of questions that systems must answer, as in any application to do human subjects research, that would push against unethical practices and relationships. And I will note, as I'm saying this, as somebody who's grounded in the US and who's giving most of my examples from there, I'm aware that the United States is not a signatory to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, right? So I'm aware that there are some international bodies that have created consensus guidelines that say the US is not a signatory to, but I don't think that that would actually get us all the way, even if we were such a signatory. A second approach, which frankly a number of bioethicists have recommended that I try, is to convene or join an advisory body to create an assessment metric for educational ethics. I personally find this fairly uninspiring and, if anything, a little bit distasteful, because the last thing I think we need in education is yet one more standardized assessment metric. But on the other hand, bioethicists have pointed out to me how transformative the concept of the quality adjusted life year, has been to public health policy around the world. By having a standardized measure for health, international, national, and even local bodies have been able to make rational, reasonable, and transparent decisions about how and where to allocate resources, whether that's money, hospitals, public health workers, kidneys, or COVID vaccines. And it's possible that we could do something similar in education. Other ways in which educational ethics could help reduce unethical practice and policy is by giving people and institutions clear pathways or techniques for making their policies and practices more ethical. We could establish special designations or even prizes for educators, school partners, districts, state agencies, ministries of education that are particularly bold or successful in making ethical progress. All right, so that was the first problem shared between bioethics and educational ethics, that of unethical behavior. Let's now move on to the hard problems question. So as in medicine, public health, and biomedical sciences, there are a number of educational practices and policies that have strong ethical valences, but exist in currently uncharted ethical waters. Let me give 3 examples, the first 2 from the new technologies raise new questions side of the ledger. So although our collective experience under COVID, I think, suggests that this is a long way off, if ever, it's possible that, say, digital technologies will at some point enable much more efficient and broadly effective approaches to educational personalization than have existed until now. So it's imaginable, I don't think likely, because I think one of the real learnings from COVID was that human relationships matter so much more than, say, any kind of perfectly designed pedagogical, right, design, right? But maybe at some point, students sitting in the same room could simultaneously and pursue entirely different math or science or even writing and history curricula and do so for years on end. There are a number of, I think, ethically appealing features of extreme personalization, pretending that this worked, right? Which I'm very clearly saying I do not think works at the moment, but pretending this worked, I do think that there's some ethically appealing features of this kind of personalization, starting with the ideals of serving every child's individual needs and enabling outstanding students to achieve excellence. There are also a number of ethically concerning features, including the potential that educational outcomes will be even more unequal than they are today, and that classrooms may no longer function as mini civil societies in which diverse people learn to work with one another over time. I have no idea how these ethical ideals and cautions stack up against one another, nor whether empirical evidence points in one direction or another about the likely outcomes of massively personalized learning. But it does seem like an important set of questions to tackle. Right, so that's the first example of like new technologies potentially giving us new questions. A second example, we know that we are all now living in the world of big data, right? Many of the concerns that have been raised about corporations or governments using and aggregating big data to track adults rely on a presumption of autonomy and rights to privacy, neither of which are necessarily thought to apply to children. Children, by definition, are subject to paternalistic intervention and control by adults. Forced school attendance is one example of this, right? And so perhaps some of these concerns with regard to adults about pervasive surveillance don't apply in the same way. Nonetheless, clearly, we should also not accept that children will be subject to total and totalizing surveillance, assessment, and redirection. Although this actually seems like a possibility as data sources grow and can increasingly be connected to one another. There are clear benefits, I think, that you could imagine that might result from linking academic data about children to their health records, to social service agency records, and involvement by those children or their parents or guardians in the criminal justice system. Problems may be able to be identified earlier and remediated faster. Children could be surrounded by a network of care and support. But also, obviously, children could ever more readily be labeled, segregated, denied services, punished, written off, so forth. Even within a single big data system, such as Google Classroom, machine learning and ordinary language processing can help and is being used to help identify students who have dyslexia or who are at risk of suicide. And it can be used and is being used to identify students who have non-mainstream political beliefs. We don't want children to learn that it's appropriate for citizens to be subject to constant and pervasive surveillance. But how should we draw these lines? This also feels like a really rich set of questions to tackle, and some work is being done in this area, but there's a lot more work to do. Then let me give you a last example of an ethical question that bedevils education policy, even in the absence of technological revolutions. Say what weight standardized tests or any other short-term measure should have in determining high stakes outcomes, including students' promotion or retention in grade, students' school admission, teacher and school leader job retention, or school closure. This kind of question is often asked in light of standardized tests' many flaws as reliable and valid determinants of academic learning. But I think it's at least as important to consider whether any short-term measure can and should serve as a reliable proxy for long-term outcomes, such as economic self-sufficiency, civic engagement, or well-being that we won't and can't know for decades down the line, especially when these uncertain long-term outcomes are posed against some known short-term harms, such as, say, having our schools closed. So again, just to wrap up, I think that theory development, public ethical inquiry, and consensus building should be really central to education policy in these areas and in many others. And hence that having a defined field of educational ethics could help. That includes a scholarly oriented strand that actually focuses on some of this theory development, has a policy oriented strand that focuses, say, on having people as stakeholder, at the table in stakeholder discussions and policymaking, in, say, clinical strands who are there, say, as advisors to school districts, to principals, to teachers, parent-teacher associations, et cetera. And then in a training strand, say, as we're preparing educators, school administrators, et cetera. And so I'll just sort of name a few things that I've been doing to try to like get this field underway, and then I'm going to wrap up and open it up for questions. So one of the things that I've been doing both on the training strand and actually the sort of, but I'd say that maybe this sort of hits all the strands, is that I've been creating these case studies I put this in the chat before, but I'll put it in again. Many of which are available at justiceinschools.org to help people have conversations about these complex ethical issues and to try basically, this is sort of for that third role of thinking about how do we mediate when there's disagreement. So for example, we used two of our case studies to lead a whole district conversation with about 380 teachers last week to think about, they were interested in thinking about the roles of controversial issues discussions in their district. They're coming under some pretty hefty political attack for what they're doing and what their policies are. And so we were there to help them sort of think about that and have conversations about that and help them realize it's not just a technocratic problem. Although there are technocratic questions and pedagogical questions about like, how do you lead good controversial issues discussions, but also these are deeply moral and ethical decisions about what you even treat as a controversial issue in the first place and so forth. Kevin mentioned that he's used our case studies, including we have this digital ethical simulation that you can see there in his own teaching, and those have gotten used in universities actually around the world. We have been creating case studies in conjunction now increasingly with scholars from around the world. We have a couple books that I'm hoping will come back out next year, focused on issues of equity in a global context and issues of civic contestation in a global context. And so that's one thing that we've been doing, is trying to create sort of these pedagogical tools for people to have conversations about these ethical issues. We've also been using these cases as tools for theory development. And I will invite those of you who are interested in thinking about ethical issues to take a look at some of the cases on the website or in our books, because I think there's a lot of really good theory that could be done that hasn't yet been done about the ethical issues at stake. As part of this sort of trying to get ethics, educational ethicists at the table, that's one reason that I agreed to serve on the Lancet COVID-19 Commission task force on safe work, safe schools, and safe travel. Bizarrely, I'm spending a lot of my time with a bunch of people who are specialists in indoor air quality, and like I'm listening to lots of conversations about the number of air exchanges per hour. But by being there, right, I can also help represent, help people understand how educators and students and parents are thinking about, whom should we be prioritizing and how do we think, and like also just how our classrooms run, and that you can't just have kids in there, you have to have adults in there, and that sort of what sorts of spaces are available in schools for adults to escape to or not. But then also to say, we need to be thinking about these issues, and we need to be thinking about how we prioritize, say, school openings versus restaurant openings, et cetera. And we need to think about, when kids are remote, are we trying to teach new material? Are we trying to support their existing knowledge? Are we encouraging them to do individual exploration? So those are I've been trying to sort of be there and have those kinds of conversations. My husband's actually an infectious disease epidemiologist, so we collaborated on a New England Journal of Medicine article a couple summers ago about the ethics of reopening primary schools. And this is all sort of this effort to say, you want educational ethicists there. It shouldn't only be, others. And then the last thing I'll mention is I've been working with Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery, thinking about universities and their legacies surrounding both enslavement and colonialism, thinking about the land acknowledgement that Kevin started with. And actually, we have been developing a set of case studies. I'll put the link in the chat in a couple minutes. I can't just write it out in real time in the same way. But we've been developing a set of case studies to support people in having conversations about the complex ethical issues surrounding universities and their histories and legacies around colonialism and enslavement, and saying it's not just about apology. There's so many other things to think about. So we're also trying to do, I'll say this is not only about K-12 education. I think it's also about higher education. I think there's also really important questions to think about with respect to adult education and informal educational spaces, which I will admit I haven't talked about today. All right, I'm going to end there.
Thank you so much, Meira, for stimulating talk. The floor is now open for questions. I'll just remind you, you can approach it in one of two ways. Raise your hand, as Kathleen just did, and tell us your question on Zoom, or put it in the chat, and we'll do our best to address it there. So I'm gonna, Kathleen, go ahead, please.
Meira, thanks for a nice talk. I had to go run an errand right in the middle, so I apologize if you addressed my question when I was stepped out for a minute. But I'm thrilled that you are putting this argument forward, and I have a couple of questions or concerns about it, but these are I hope they're generative questions. And so the first question has to do with the challenges of using the medical field as a model, given our field's experience with using the medical model of professionalism as the sort of model that got taken up in the 80s and the 90s to sort of boost up the professional reputation of educators. That medical model is not perfect. It's not a perfect fit in a lot of ways. And this is different, and I understand that, but I'm hoping you could address that a little bit. And then the other thing, this is a practical issue, but or maybe just a challenge in how this gets worked out on the ground. But well, there's two issues here. One is like, I'll just name one because I have so many, and I'll email you later maybe, but it's about the space that's afforded philosophy in general in a lot of ed schools. And the space that's afforded in my ed school is now really taken up with social justice. And social justice, of course, can be taught philosophically, but that's not really who teaches those courses. And that's not the discipline that informs social justice teaching and theorizing at my institution. And so I find, and I've seen Robert Starrett writes about this in terms of the field of educational leadership. And I sit in a department of educational leadership. And he writes about how ethics has gotten pushed out by social justice. And that's not, and again, that shouldn't be a problem, but that it's in the way that social justice has been sort of construed in a lot of ed schools like mine, it's not a philosophical project. It's something different. And so just wondering how you might respond to either of those questions, comments, whatever we want to call them.
Great. Yes. So let me start with the latter one first, because that actually is, I think, a somewhat easier one for me to answer. I'm just, my only problem is that I realized that when I tried to log on to the journal, Harvard immediately like logged me in. So I'm not sure if this link will work, but I think this DOI will work. So I am entirely with you that both philosophy of education is not solely philosophy of social justice, and that the way that we talk about social justice in education is is really crimped. Like it's really, there's so much. I mean, this is one thing that political theory is good about, is thinking about social justice, right? And there's a lot, and no political theorist would say, oh yeah, we know social justice when we see it, and there is a vision of social justice, and we just all go that way. And it's such a narrow conversation in ethics, and that's actually in education, and that's one of the reasons actually that I started this project. But let me explain the link that I put in. So I'm not, hopefully, if you just Google that DOI, it'll get you there. So Harry Brighouse and Tatiana Giron, who's a really, really, really fabulous, almost PhD from here. She's just finishing her thesis now. And I wrote a piece on conceptions of educational equity that we published in AERA Open a couple months ago, about not about social justice, but about equity, which is another one of these terms. We've been talking about actually doing one about social justice in particular, to say where it's so frustrating. People say, oh, we know what equity is, and we are equity oriented educators, and then they think that because they say that they're oriented toward equity, what their policies are, right? And therefore we have a standardized curriculum. We don't have a standardized curriculum. We hate all tests. We love tests. Who knows? Right? There's so many, because equity is so complicated as a concept. Even if you have a clear conception of equity, that doesn't mean that you clearly agree on what equity means in a particular context, right? There's all of this space for empirical insight, for contextual stuff, for judgment, right? And so in fact, one of the reasons that I got started on this work was when I showed up at the ed school as a professor. That first year or two, I had a whole series of students marching through my office saying to me, oh, Dr. Levinson, I am so glad you've joined the faculty, because I believe in education for social justice. And then they would stop and they would think they had told me what their substantive beliefs were, and that I was going to be on their side. And when I probed, they were all over the map, right? Some were ardent charter school supporters, and some were ardent charter school opponents, and some believed that teachers unions were the greatest, and others believed that they were horrific, all sorts, right? And so that's, I think, a big part of this work, is actually to try to push back against this idea that we can draw on, that we can use certain kinds of normative language, and that closes off the conversation as opposed to opening up the conversation. And that's actually what we try to do with a lot of these case studies, is make it so that, sure, we can all agree that equity matters, but that doesn't mean that we agree on what we should do with this kid or this classroom or this school assignment policy. And so now we actually have to talk about that, because we can't just say, well, I believe in equity. So that's the second question, is that I actually hope that this will support the kinds of things that I think you and I would agree that we would like. To your first question, I totally agree about the challenges of using the medical field as a model. And in fact, there's a whole section of this talk that I took out for time reasons that's about all of the things that have gone wrong in bioethics, and why bioethics as a field is a problematic field. And so this question about how could educational ethics avoid some of the problems that bioethics has. And I'm happy to talk more about that if we have time, or talk more about it with you offline. And that's just about bioethics. That's not even about the extent to which we sort of give bioethics and medicine a sort of primacy and say, oh, look, education, we should be like them, which is, I think, a second problem that is what you're identifying. At the same time, I think actually we are seeing some shifts in medicine, and particularly in public health. And I think it's really public health that is the more parallel thing to education, right? Because they're both in some ways about these population level questions. that might actually be encouraging for education. So actually an epidemiologist and I have written an article that is currently under review, arguing that the social determinants of health, we should actually have a, we should adopt the conception similarly of the social determinants of learning. And that one of the things that the social determinants of health movement has done in public health has been to take the source of sort of critique and attention out of the bodies of people who are ill, and to ask, what are the systems, right, that are creating and supporting illness, right, as opposed to health. And that I think actually, and that the social determinants of health we saw were really powerful in how people thought about and responded to COVID, where from very, very early on, there really was attention to group disparities, to questions about equity, to, you know, like trying to shift away from blaming certain people for not, you know, isolating or getting vaccinated or whatever, and to say, asking, so what are the social determinants that are leading to these people, say, not engaging in those practices? And I think similarly, if we thought about the social determinants of learning, that might lead us to think about, again, how is it that we step away from placing blame about learning and lack of learning in the bodies of individual kids, or even in particular groups, and ask, what are the social determinants that are, you know, permitting flowing of learning and you know, stopping learning or stopping access to learning and so forth, in this way, in the same way as health. It's not perfect. There's lots of concerns. And in a way, there's nothing new about that, right? There's been lots of, you know, thinking in education about these kinds of things. But our argument is that in the same way that the social determinants of health literature has helped shift the public health field in certain ways, maybe if we adopted that in the social determinants of learning, it might shift education slightly.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks, Kathleen, and thanks, Meira. Maybe, well, in case you know, there may be some questions to follow up. I actually had a question that relates to Kathleen's question about the appropriateness of the medical bioethics model as a model for the teaching profession, but I think it addresses a sort of perspective on that you didn't address in your answer, and I'm curious what you might say. And you know, sort of my curiosity is about, you know, the fact that bioethics, presumably, I don't know that much about the history of it really, but presumably, you know, developed in the context of a profession that was given a great deal of sort of social esteem and respect, and where the sort of the expertise of doctors was taken seriously, not only sort of in universities and other areas, but, you know, in their offices and their clinics, hospitals. Whereas, you know, teachers not only don't have, maybe have a different sort of model, or there may be a different model of professionalism that's appropriate to teachers, but teachers often aren't recognized as professionals at all, right, in the first place. And their autonomy is severely limited. And so that's one aspect of what I'm curious about. Like, how do you get a field of educational ethics based on the bioethics model off the ground in a very different sort of context of social respect for and esteem for the status, the professional status of teachers? And maybe this isn't a different angle, but it's just a different sort of perspective on the same problem. But, you know, like schools and debates about, ethical debates about schools are often, and increasingly in a kind of polarized world, the site of some really, really, you know, nutty views, right? Like, teachers cannot, you know, because of legal and other restrictions, do much. to fight back in some contexts where, you know, there's a lot of community support for not talking about seahorses because it normalizes the idea of male pregnancy, right? So, you know, how, again, I mean, I could see a field of educational ethics really being helpful, you know, in addressing those sorts of problems. But how do you get from point A to point B when the profession isn't recognized in the first place?
Those are great questions, Kevin. Thank you. Again, let's take the second one about, you know, sort of like, what about the fact that there are people who are really nutty about education? You know, unfortunately, we're also seeing examples where they're really, really nutty about medicine and public health too, right? You know, we have Ron DeSantis, who just massively won the governorship of Florida, in large part on, you know, grounds claiming, you know, not only the don't say gay stuff and like a bunch of this, you know, the sort of culture war stuff, but also like, you know, I promoted freedom by not requiring masks, and in fact by forcing people back to work and kids back to schools with no masks, and like these theories, you know, and we see craziness about, say, you know, 10-year-old pregnant girls should learn to embrace their roles as mothers and hopefully find fulfillment in that. So in that respect, at least right now in the United States, I mean, there's just a lot of nuttiness in, I think, medicine and public health, as well as in education. So I'm not sure that we're so different there. And obviously, again, thinking about the United States, the nuttiness around climate science has been very long-standing, and around evolution and creationism and so forth. Like, you know, there's just a really, really, really long tradition of anti-scientific thinking and politics in the United States. And we saw it in Brazil, and right, you know, it's not just in the United States, so we see it in the Philippines, et cetera. So there, I think education may not be that different. But this question about the professional status of educators as opposed to, say, doctors and scientists, I think is a really, really, really good point, because you're right. They do have different professional standing. And when we think about the development of bioethics, that is from a standpoint of, say, doctors and scientists being treated essentially as God. And then this question of, like, you know, who should exercise control over them, versus in schools where, yes, certainly nobody's treating educators, you know, as God, right? Here, I don't know, this may be a response that's just like about redefining everything as a nail and saying, no, educational ethics serves this too. But I actually think that part of what is going on in education is that there is total disrespect for people who have a different policy position or set of practices or beliefs in education, right, than, you know, you do. Like, it is about saying, I believe in equity, or I believe in social justice, or I believe in merit, or I believe in whatever it is I believe. And therefore, you know, I also believe X and Y. And if you believe not X, or even just Y prime, then clearly it means that you're immoral, unethical, that you've been captured by the teachers' unions or captured by the corporate textbook lobby or whatever it is, right? And like, clearly you don't actually deserve any respect because you have no values. And I actually think that part of building up the profession is making more evident and more visible, and then supporting conversation about the fact that there are really complicated ethical decisions here, and that it's not just that when people do something you disagree with, it's because they're idiots or stooges, right? But actually because it's complicated. And that we also need to point out that so many of these choices are choices that educators and school leaders and district leaders are going to have the capacity to make, right? That you can't script out everything. You can't just pass laws that are going to that are going to remove judgment. And so if they are working in an area in which they must exercise judgment, that there's no way to do the work without exercising judgment, then we should also support their capacities to develop and exercise that judgment. That may be totally idealistic, but that would be, I think, my response.
Thanks, Meira. I look forward to talking with you more about that. There don't seem to be any other questions on the floor. I'm going to give people one more chance, but it is 5:16, so I'll give the last word to Kathleen. And then just before you come in, Kathleen, I'm going to tell everyone, I put it in the chat earlier, but it was sort of premature. I'm putting a link to the CSLP YouTube channel where Meira's talk and this discussion will be posted, the video of it, in the coming weeks. And there are other talks that you can view there as well that have happened in the past. Okay. Kathleen.
So again, really interested in the project. And so I'm just thinking out loud about interdisciplinarity as an asset in this project. An explicit interdisciplinarity, and I'm not sure whether you've considered this or to what extent this would be an asset or a detriment. It's hard to teach. I mean, I'm in a really critical department, and it's hard to teach ethics in a way that students don't say, well, what about power, right? So I wonder, and it could be just that it's the way I'm teaching, but I wonder about teaching and the project that you're describing being self-consciously interdisciplinary in such a way that it speaks, that it's fluent in both legal forms of power and political forms of power, or cognizant of those in a way that doesn't sort of make ethics sort of that it flattens out the political project or flattens out the ethical project, but it's conscious of being in that space. And I'm not being very articulate here, but like, I wonder if you've thought about that tension maybe in your project, and if you're committed to sort of self-consciously committed to the philosophical in a purist way that attempts to recognize the importance of this space, because as we were saying earlier, it's not recognized enough in the ed school in general. So I wondered if you thought about that.
Great question. Yes, I've actually thought a ton about this. And so I'm also going to hope that people will take this invitation. So I entirely believe that educational ethics needs to be an interdisciplinary enterprise. And I was focusing on sort of philosophy and moral and political philosophy today in my talk, probably actually in part because it's a vestige of, I started thinking about this as a way to talk to philosophers about this, and like, and I didn't thoroughly strip it of that with this audience, but I actually really firmly believe that educational ethics needs to be a multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary enterprise, and also sort of multi-perspectival in that we need academics, we need policymakers, we need practitioners, we need concerned citizens, right? Like that's the other thing. It can't just be scholars talking to each other. And so, for example, in our two extant books, Democratic Discourse in Schools and Dilemmas of Educational Ethics, one of the things that we have, you may know, is that we have these case studies in there, and then each case study is followed by 6 commentaries. And in Dilemmas of Educational Ethics, which was our first book, of those 6 commentaries, we always had 2 by philosophers because we wanted to show that there wasn't just one way for a philosopher to think about the case. So we had to have 2 philosophers so that they could, model different like disagreement or just different pathways to go down. And then we intentionally invited legal scholars, historians, psychologists, educational researchers, superintendents, teachers, et cetera. In democratic discord in schools, we were less concerned about modeling the philosophical disagreement. So at that point, we, sort of did 6 respondents just across, and we started bringing in students. In the 2 new books that I mentioned on civic contestation and on educational equity in a global context, we're actually doing these as conversations. So we're bringing together usually 4 people, again, from different positionalities and standpoints to talk about the case together, and then we're transcribing and editing those conversations. And again, many of those conversations, but not all of them, include philosophers, but they all include also others, people from different disciplinary backgrounds, experiential backgrounds, etc. And then I hope that those of you who are either watching this on YouTube or still miraculously on this meeting at 5:21 will be interested in coming to a field launching conference that we're going to do at Harvard. And you can come in person or virtually. It'll be live streamed. I don't yet have the information for registering. That'll go online, and I'm hoping the next month or 2. But May 4th to 6th, here at Harvard, we're going to have a field launching conference for educational ethics. And what you'll see is that every panel tends to have, most have a philosopher on them. None has more than 2 philosophers. And in most cases, we very intentionally have activists, legal scholars, psychologists, historians, educators, university presidents, economists, comparativists, etc. Bioethics is itself a very interdisciplinary enterprise, and that is one of its challenges, but I think also one of its strengths. And I think that is something we need for educational ethics too.
Thanks once again to Kathleen, to Meira, and others who posed questions in the chat. And thank you all for coming. I think it was a very stimulating talk, and I'm excited to see how this project of developing a field of educational ethics develops, and I really hope it's successful.
Thanks.
Thanks, Meira.
Thanks, Meira, and thank you, everyone. I'll just mention very quickly, we do have some other talks in the series coming up, and so keep an eye out for publicity about those, and check out the YouTube channel. All right.
Great. Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye.